For centuries, theologians, philosophers, apologists, and skeptics has been arguing over whether or not there's any evidence for the existence of an actual God. And my take on that debate is that they's asking the wrong question. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by Dr. William Lane Craig. I don't know about you, but I'm in the mood for something a little different. Not too different, just a little change of pace. Well, fortunately for us, Dr. Craig is ready to shift gears too. After spending the last 4 chapters on the arguments for God's existence, starting in chapter 7, he's going to tackle what he thinks is the best arguments against God's existence. Quote, in the previous 4 chapters, we've seen 4 powerful arguments for the existence of God based on philosophical, scientific, and moral considerations. Together, they make up a strong case for belief in God. But of course, we need to consider the evidence on the other side of the scale too. Can the unbeliever offer equally powerful arguments to show that God does not exist? End quote. And just by way of reminder, his previous 4 arguments was the argument from contingency, the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, and the moral argument. These is the 4 arguments that Dr. Craig considers to be the best arguments in favor of God's existence. Or at least I presume they's his best case. I can't imagine an apologist having a better argument and saying, I better keep this one a secret. If Dr. Craig is only going to put 4 arguments for God in a book, he ain't going to waste space on an inferior argument when he's got a better one. And what's interesting is that none of these arguments is really an argument in favor of the existence of a specifically Christian God. You'd think that if the Christian God was the one true God, he'd have better evidence than any other God. But that ain't the case. Each of Dr. Craig's arguments is simply a matter of taking some aspect of the real world that folks has a hard time understanding and then just arbitrarily giving his personal favorite deity credit for it. And you could do that with your own favorite deity just as easily, no matter what your favorite deity or deities might be. Heck, you could even do it with spontaneous magical entropy reversal fields, or Smurfs. It don't even need to be a personal being, because the only thing that's strictly necessary is the magic. And since magic don't obey ordinary rules, ain't no reason why it couldn't act like a person without actually being a person. It's magic. You can't explain magic. So Dr. Craig's 4 best arguments for the existence of God is arguments that don't necessarily require his God to exist. And I think that ought to tell us something, especially considering that Dr. Craig ain't just some random YouTuber sitting in his car filming himself with his phone. He's a smart feller with probably the best education a Christian apologist could get. If anybody knows his stuff, it's him. And his 4 best arguments for the existence of God is all arguments that just give God credit for stuff that don't require the Christian God. So anyways, that catches us up to chapter 7, and now it's time for Dr. Craig to try and debunk the arguments against God. And he starts off with a jolly bit of good news for the believer. Quote, as a matter of fact, there really aren't very many arguments against God's existence. The atheist's main complaint is that there isn't any evidence for God's existence. End quote. That certainly sounds like good news for the believer, don't it? If we's keeping score strictly by counting who has the most arguments, the apologists would be way ahead. They keep coming up with bad arguments for God's existence, and then skeptics point out exactly how and why they's bad, and the apologists just try a new argument that's just as bad. And round we go. For perspective, let me just point out that there ain't very many arguments against the existence of talking purple unicorns, or against Pokemon being real, or against fairies that only little kids can see. If and they ain't no good reason to believe that something does exist, we don't need very many arguments that they don't. And that comes back to Dr. Craig's observation that the atheist's main complaint is that there ain't any evidence for God's existence. And let me just say right up front here that I agree with Dr. Craig that this is a bad argument. In fact, it might be the very worst argument skeptics could make. And here's why. If and we say that they ain't no evidence for God, that gives the apologists an opening or two that they can use to their advantage. On the one hand, they can claim that this just shows that atheists is ignorant. Believers has all kinds of stuff that they take as evidence, if not proof, of God's existence. So if we say there ain't no evidence, the apologists can just claim to know something that we don't. And that makes the apologist sound like the expert, at least to some folks. And on the other hand, if an apologist wants to be a little bit more aggressive, they can claim that, in fact, there is evidence and we know it. We's just suppressing the truth in unrighteousness, like it says in Romans 1:18 and following. And I know you've heard apologists quote that one. They love Romans 1 because believers eat it up. Believers love to hear how non-Christians is sinners, because that makes Christians look good without them having to brag about it, so they can be better than us and still be humble. Win-win. Now, I know why we make this argument. We ain't trying to set ourselves up to be generous to apologists and hand them golden opportunities like that. We's just trying to put the burden of proof where it belongs, on the folks making the extraordinary claims. Skeptics has been doing this for thousands of years, which means that apologists has had thousands of years of practice in how to get around it and turn it to their advantage. So I say it's time we changed our strategy and hand them an argument they ain't so prepared to handle. When I talk about the evidence for God, I don't say they ain't no evidence, because that'd be trying to prove a negative, and that ain't impossible, but we'd be starting at a disadvantage. What I say is that actually there's tons of evidence that is directly relevant to the question of whether God exists. The reason I think he don't exist is because literally 100% of that evidence is more consistent with the conclusion that God's a myth than with the conclusion that he's real. And maybe you can see right away how that's a whole lot stronger argument to make. But if not, let me give you some examples. Let's compare the two conclusions and ask what real-world observation we'd expect to make if in the one was true versus if in the other was true. Suppose that God is just a myth. What would be the most natural consequence that would result from him being fictional? Well, obviously, the biggest consequence would be the fact that we wouldn't never see him showing up in real life. Being a fictional character, he can only show up in stories that folks tell about him supposedly showing up in real life. So the fact that he don't show up in real life is consistent with the myth hypothesis. Now, can apologists come up with post hoc rationalizations for why he don't show up? Sure. You can come up with post hoc rationalizations for just about anything. But the thing is, the myth hypothesis don't require us to add any post hoc rationalizations. It's already consistent right from the get-go. And that means the myth hypothesis is more consistent with reality than the gospel hypothesis. Or, let's take apologetics itself. If the gospel hypothesis was true, we'd naturally expect that God wouldn't need no apologists. The gospel says he loves us and wants to be with us forever, and that Jesus died and rose again to take care of the sin problem so's we could be together forever. So okay, forever started a long time ago, and God already done took care of the sin problem. So he ought to be showing up in real life just like the Bible says he wants to do and is able to do. And if he was doing that, we wouldn't need no apologists. We'd all see for ourselves firsthand that he was real. And I know some folks is going to start pulling out all the post hoc rationalizations that apologists has been polishing up for the past 2,000 years. But let me just point out that God showing up in real life to spend time with us is the outcome that would be most consistent with the gospel. If Jesus had never ascended into heaven at the end of the Gospels and the beginning of the book of Acts, ain't no Christian would find that surprising or confusing. No believer would go up to an immortal, resurrected Jesus who was still here and start explaining to him that it was all wrong for him to still be here on account of all the post hoc rationalizations that apologists use to try and account for the fact that he ain't. There's no outcome that's more consistent with the gospel or even as consistent with the gospel as Jesus continuing to abide here on earth with his beloved disciples who he just got done dying for so that he could be with them forever. So that's the outcome we ought to expect if the gospel was true. Now, of course, under the myth hypothesis, there ain't no resurrected Savior to hang around and show up in real life. So we'd expect folks to need somebody to give them reasons to keep on believing the myth in the absence of their Messiah. And that's apologists. So the existence of apologists is consistent with the myth hypothesis right out the gate. We don't need no post hoc rationalizations to explain why it'd take human effort to maintain the myth in God's absence. Human effort is exactly what we would expect given the myth hypothesis being correct. And once again, our real-world observations is more consistent with the myth hypothesis than with the gospel hypothesis. But we can take it even further than that. What kind of arguments is apologists going to be able to use if the myth hypothesis is correct? Well, if God's just a myth, then apologists ain't going to be able to use any arguments that require the existence of a real God before you can make the argument. The only arguments apologists is going to be able to make is arguments you can make whether there's any God there or not. And what kind of arguments do apologists make? Dr. Craig just got done showing us the 4 apologetic arguments that he thinks is the best arguments he can make in favor of God's existence. And in every case, his argument boils down to, here's something in the real world that's hard for folks to understand, and therefore my God did it. Well, human understanding's limited, and there's always going to be things in the universe that's hard for folks to understand, so you're always going to have material you can use to give God credit for. God don't need to actually exist in order for apologists to give him credit for stuff that folks don't understand. So Dr. Craig's 4 best arguments for God is arguments that don't actually require any God's existence. And that's exactly consistent with the outcome we'd expect if God was just a myth. Apologists can come up with post hoc rationalizations for why they can't come up with better arguments than that, but the myth hypothesis is already consistent with reality without the need for any post hoc rationalizations. So once again, the evidence that's there is more consistent with the myth hypothesis than with the gospel hypothesis. And I was just getting warmed up here. There's tons more I could say about why we'd expect a myth to emphasize faith and subjective personal experience over testable and verifiable claims, and why we'd expect to see doctrinal divisions and conflicting theologies, and why believers would be so tempted to try and mingle religion and politics. And I expect I'll get to more of that material as I continue making videos, because it's all good stuff. But right now, we're supposed to be doing a series covering Dr. Craig's book, and so far we ain't got past the first 2 paragraphs of Chapter 7, so I was feeling a bit guilty. Let's get on back to the book. As I said earlier, if a non-believer tells an apologist that there ain't no evidence for God, the apologist is going to start salivating, because that's just the kind of response they was hoping for. Quote, when the unbeliever says there's no evidence that God exists, you can stop him dead in his tracks by saying, gosh, I can think of at least 4 good arguments that show that God exists. And at that point, he's going to say, like what? And you're off and running. End quote. And there you go. Apologists loves to hear unbelievers say that they ain't no evidence because that's just an open invitation for 'em to start blabbing about all their favorite arguments. But he's wrong about one thing. The believer don't necessarily have to say, like what? If the apologist says, I have 4 arguments for God, the unbeliever can say, yeah, but arguments ain't the same as evidence. Anybody can make an argument whether their claim is true or not, but evidence can only be there if their claim is actually true. And I think that the conversation from there would deviate quite a bit from the script that Dr. Craig is recommending to believers. Naturally, I can't resist pointing out that this is yet another case of the myth hypothesis being more consistent with the facts than the gospel hypothesis is. If God's just a myth, you'd expect apologists to have arguments instead of verifiable evidence, and you'd also expect apologists to try and make arguments look like evidence. And that's exactly what we're seeing right here. Dr. Craig is acting exactly the way we'd expect him to if God's a myth. Dr. Craig continues, quote, you'll find non-believers are often so ill-equipped to discuss these issues that all they can do in response to the arguments is just repeat themselves, that's no evidence that God exists, end quote. And sadly enough, this is a pervasive attitude among believers in general and apologists in particular. The apologist will present an argument instead of verifiable evidence, and the non-believer will point out the fallacies and other flaws in the argument, and the apologist will just ignore the substance of the objections and just insist that the non-believer is simply denying the evidence, even though it's just an argument and not actual evidence. And I don't think I need to mention the fact that we'd expect apologists to refuse to address the flaws in their arguments if the myth hypothesis is true. So I won't mention that. Dr. Craig goes on, quote, they've been taught to repeat, there's no evidence for God's existence like a mantra, apparently believing that saying it again and again somehow makes it true. It's really a cover for intellectual laziness and a lack of engagement. It's just a way of saying, I'm not convinced by your arguments, end quote. And notice how he's being careful here to associate not being convinced with intellectual laziness and lack of engagement. He's the one refusing to address the actual objections to his arguments and dismissing them as being just an empty, mindless mantra, and yet somehow it's the non-believer who's being intellectually lazy by not being convinced. Not to mention the irony of an apologist in a book of scripts for believers to use on unbelievers, accusing unbelievers of mindlessly repeating talking points that somebody's taught them. Do you get the impression that maybe Dr. Craig is venting just a little bit of his own personal frustration here? It must really suck to devote your entire career to convincing folks of stuff you ain't got any actual evidence for, and then have them not be convinced by your arguments. Dr. Craig responds to this supposed intellectual laziness by recommending further engagement. Quote, so, if the unbeliever responds to your arguments by saying, that's no evidence that God exists, just say politely, well, you must think that some of my premises are false. Which premise do you reject, and why? End quote. As we mentioned when we was going through the earlier chapters in this book, this is a trap. Dr. Craig is framing the discussion as if every premise is either undeniably true or undeniably false. He's leaving out all the ways that a premise can be flawed by being ambiguous, leaving out relevant information, or including irrelevant points as if they was relevant. And this maximizes opportunities for the apologist to confuse the issue by sneaking in assumptions and equivocating in the terms he's using. And by the way, that's why arguments ain't as reliable as actual evidence, and why apologists would rather talk about the arguments. Dr. Craig continues with another apologist story about this one atheist he met one time who supposedly said he rejected all of Dr. Craig's premises. And of course, Dr. Craig proceeded to catch him in the inevitable gotcha. Quote, to which I replied, surely you don't reject all of them. Do you reject that the universe exists, or that the fine-tuning of the universe is due to physical necessity, chance, or design? He recognized that his remark had been careless. Try to get the unbeliever to engage with your specific premises. End quote. And the thing about scripted conversations is that apologists has been working their whole career to tweak their arguments for maximum effectiveness against unwary lay people. He's had these same conversations over and over and over again with ordinary folks who ain't got his experience in philosophy and debating. And he's used their responses as data in order to, pardon the expression, fine-tune each and every word to exploit common weaknesses that unprepared folks is likely to be vulnerable to. So yeah, he definitely wants believers to memorize his little scripts exactly as he has presented them, and to keep working to force unbelievers to follow his script. He's learned from experience how to take advantage of folks, and he wants to train believers to be just as good at exploiting them. Quote, all this underscores the importance of having these brief arguments memorized. Doing so will help you to stay on track. End quote. And this from the feller who at the top of this same page was accusing believers of intellectual laziness for supposedly repeating what they'd been taught to say. Dr. Craig wraps up with a classic apologetics defense. Quote, of course, even if there were no evidence for God's existence, that's no proof that God does not exist. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. A suspect might still be the murderer, even if there is no evidence that he is. End quote. And I think this gets down to the very heart and soul of apologetics. For reasons that's entirely unrelated to the question of whether or not God actually exists, the believer wants to believe that God exists. As long as the apologist can convincingly argue that skeptics have not proven beyond all reasonable doubt that God does not exist, the believer still has permission to believe whatever they want to believe. And that's all an apologist needs to do. The apologist ain't actually there to convert skeptics, although of course they wouldn't mind if they did. The apologist is there to give believers excuses to keep on believing. It's all about creating some kind of hope that maybe the skeptics is wrong somehow. At the end of the day, after all his arguments has failed and the skeptics ain't been convinced, Dr. Craig can still declare that maybe God might be real anyway, no matter what the evidence actually shows. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, Dr. Craig is going to continue his endless search for stuff he can claim that atheists is wrong about. Not that it's going to do him any good. Sure, it should be interesting watching him flail. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.